Welcome to Talk to Brazil with Tom Rioch, the business connector to business in Brazil. Welcome to Talk to Brazil, the Business Connection, a leading Brazil business podcast talking about business in the world. I'm Tom Rioch, an American from Pittsburgh and living in Brazil, known for business networking and talking from my podcast studio in Campinas, São Paulo, Brazil. Today's guest is Uriel Jaroslawski, and he's talking with us from Niterói in the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Uriel is CPO and CTO at Quico, that's Q-U-I-C-K-O, here in Brazil. He's a specialist in urban mobility, e-commerce, marketplace, software development, product management, machine learning, M&A, and digital transformation. He has worked in Chile, Argentina, studied high-performance computing at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and engineering and information systems at Universidade del SEMA in Buenos Aires. So with that, Uriel, welcome to Talk to Brazil Business Connection.
Good morning, Tom. Thank you very much for having me here. Very happy to be here with you.
It's interesting. I found you on LinkedIn basically because of the Carnegie Mellon connection, which is from Pittsburgh. But I noticed on your LinkedIn profile that you speak English, Portuguese besides Spanish, but also Chinese. Why Chinese?
I like your question. Well, first of all, I'm not that fluent in Chinese yet. But the first part of the answer would be that I like learning languages a lot since I was a little kid. And when I was kind of fluent in Portuguese, I wanted to learn a fourth language. In this case, Chinese. I was very convinced that it was going to be very influential in terms of technology and world commerce. But it didn't have any practical reason for me at the time. Mm-hmm. There's a famous Steve Jobs quote that you can only connect the dots backward. So in this case, it was something that I was interested in. I was curious about the Chinese culture, and I decided to take the challenge and start learning. And the part of the why now, when I started, had to do with moving to Brazil. When I lived in Chile, I realized that there's a big opportunity when you move to a different city, a different country, mm-hmm. to build your schedule from start and use that chance to learn something new and to design the life you want to build from that point. Right. And in Chile, I played it by ear, but when I moved to Brazil, I decided I have to start learning Chinese. I didn't have a lot of friends or family in Brazil, so it was my schedule was going to be occupied by something at first. Could be Netflix, could be going to the movies or running. And I decided I wanted to start learning a new language. In this case, was Chinese. Mm-hmm. So I started. I hired a teacher that I found online. Then I realized she didn't even speak fluent Portuguese. She didn't speak English, so it was very hilarious. I had to learn Chinese at some point because there was no other way we could communicate fluently. And
that's today in the global world. That's the challenge, right?
Exactly.
With 8 billion people out there, where do we find common touch points for communication? And sometimes it's just like you did. You just have to do it.
Exactly. So it was very, very interesting. It was very difficult at first. And after a year and a half, I started realizing that I understood a lot. And of course, I had to practice a lot more now. But I recommend anybody who is in that type of transition, like moving to a new city, new country, new job. It's a great opportunity to decide get other new things on board that maybe make a difference after 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, we've seen, looking out into today's world, we talk about e-commerce and marketplace, which are your specialties, and you look to China today. Expertise in e-commerce and marketplace is in China, but also your background in studying computer science. Computer science is sort of universal, I think. I'm not a technical person, but from what I see from persons who are technically oriented, it's more the coding, it's more the programming necessarily than a spoken language, right? How do you feel that? Again, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, you studied in the States. How common is computer science? When you went to Pittsburgh and you studied at Carnegie Mellon, what was different there?
I believe that when we talk about computer science, there are not that many different stories about computer science in the world. It all comes from almost the same sources. But what does change is the culture where you study and where you apply that knowledge. And I had a very interesting experience in Argentina. I studied in a university that was new in computing engineering, but it had a very strong background in economics. So I intentionally took some electives in economy or in related subjects. And in Carnegie Mellon was more specialized in this high performance computing in supercomputers. At that time, there was not that many cloud computing companies, and it was still a huge data center with a lot of equipment that was involved. And so it was very specific learning, but part of the experience was getting involved in the culture and understanding how people from other cities, countries think. What do they know about Latin America? What do they don't know about Latin America? Right. And it was, I think that was as important as the content itself for me in this case. And I enjoyed that experience very much. But when we talk about culture after studying, I do think that the company culture is very different depending on the country where you go. Mm-hmm. It's different between Argentina and Chile. It's different between Argentina and the States. It's different between Brazil, Mexico. And I had the opportunity to deal with different combination of those cultures. Right. You mentioned M&A. When I was starting my career at Mercado Libre, I had the opportunity to work in a few M&As really, really young in my career. And I struggled with cultural differences. And I learned a lot from that experience. Like the Argentinian style is kind of straightforward. Right. And it still has this Latin American identity that you do need a lot of personal involvement and build trust and the Latin American way. But when you go to meeting, when you try to solve a problem, you speak your mind. And I realized that was not the same case in other countries in Latin America. In Mexico, everybody, when I approached this company we were acquiring, we were saying yes for every suggestion I made. I felt that was weird, and then I realized they're not meaning yes. Yeah. And I had to discover that after a while. There's not a worse or better culture. It's the culture that works for certain business, for a certain market. And I think that was part of the learning experience in terms of the question you asked.
Well, even Pittsburgh, while you were there, is the same thing. Pittsburgh is it's a large city in its own right. but it also has a large number of subcultures, because it has, through its history of immigration, you have a lot of different groups there. Even though, from my time in Pittsburgh, you called who was someone from Pittsburgh. It was a real melting pot, literally. But what I see today, when many, let's say, Americans or Europeans, when they look to Latin America specifically, look to Brazil, look to Argentina, they sort of considered everything all the same. They consider Brazil's one thing. Brazil's large and not necessarily one thing. Argentina's not one place. Argentina has a lot of subcultures within the country, even Chile.
Absolutely.
So I think, and part of when we look at e-commerce today, everybody says, well, it's the same, just open up your marketplace and you're in business. But I think you can't overlook the local cultural implications of all of that.
Absolutely. It's very common that large companies, when they expand to Latin America, they mention Latin America as one place that the challenge of leading a business in Colombia is absolutely different from the experience in Brazil. And Argentina and every country has its own challenges. In fact, one of these M&As I worked on in my earlier years in Mercado Libre was a company in Venezuela, and there were things that I couldn't understand at the moment, like how does this currency exchange work? Like,
right.
Why one of my first projects, I had to develop a fix for the marketplace pricing where we could support 2 or 3 different kinds of the same currency of the country. Mm-hmm. And it was like a transition where they were adding like multiple zeros at the end. But at the same point, the government was controlling a lot of the companies that were not promoting the new currency. And there was a very specific political and economical context that I didn't know at the time, and I had to develop software to fix that for Mercado Libre at the moment. So it was very specific in part of the learning curve of what Latin American culture and political and economical context is, and it differs from country to country.
Well, now you're in a company called Quico, which is a specialist in urban mobility, correct?
Exactly.
I think when you get to urban mobility, you really become local, because even the culture of mobility within any community differs from one place to another. I live here in Campinas, and close to Campinas, we have a number of municipalities that are very close. And one that strikes me is a little city called Indaiatuba. And Indaiatuba probably has one of the highest incidents of the use of bicycles. And as you look around different localities here, you can really see how that affects. So when you look at urban mobility, you're not looking at one thing, are you?
Absolutely. In fact, we are launching in Campinas now. Happy to tell you that. And I think that the world right now is starting to embrace digital transformations that were not that easy 10 or 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Fintechs and marketplaces now are very common in the internet world. But when we talk about urban mobility, education, and some industries that involve more players in the game, they are now starting to be disrupted. So urban mobility, when you talk about a solution like Quicos, we're basically a platform that when you download our application, you can decide with better information how to get from point A to point B. You have real-time buses. You can buy public transportation tickets and also other e-hailings through our application. And when you talk about the local problem, it always involves data and partnerships that are super local. Mm-hmm. And if I want to give you real-time buses information, there's no way I can do that nationally right now in a country like Brazil. There's no super API I can plug in and get that information.
Right.
So I have to knock the door city by city, and obviously there are players that work on aggregating data and providing services, but it's very new when you talk about the end user experience. So we are putting a lot of effort, investing a lot of effort in learning how to deal with those sets of data that we don't have the very first moment, how we learn from the community of users, and how we build strong partnerships. That some of them, they work nationally, some of them work in Latin America in general. Like we have a shared bicycle partner that is present in other countries in Latin America, but sometimes it's a solution or an operator that works in a specific city. So it has all the flavors.
Well, I agree with you. To succeed in Brazil is like putting together a puzzle. And when you say there are national companies that have penetration, there are very few. For our listeners, Brazil has over 5,000 municipalities. And if we're talking of municipalities local and its needs and requirements for mobility, urban mobility, are different, that's the challenge. And you really have few national options. But I think there's still growth. There is a lot of growth and a lot of success coming to Brazil because it's really what you're doing step by step.
Exactly. I think that the common denominator in the country is that there's a digital transformation happening no matter what. So if you talk about Salvador, if you talk about São Paulo, Rio, everything is going to be transformed at some point in this digital trend in every industry we are looking at. And we are becoming a strong partner for many cities that do want to be part of that change, but sometimes they don't have the technology or the tools or the ecosystem view to do that properly.
Right.
And I won't deny there are some cases where it's very difficult to talk to local governments and solve some challenges that maybe back when I was working in an e-commerce marketplace was more depending on our own development products and integrations. In this case, there's a lot of public policy going on. There's a lot of partnerships that I wasn't used to comparing to my previous experience. And even knowing that sometimes it's difficult, I'm realizing that every time there's more cities, more companies that do want to be part of that change, and that it's very encouraging.
No, even from an investor standpoint, there's investment to be had for companies or platforms like yourself who want to grow. Campinas is another example. Campinas is a smart city. I think it values the fact of being a smart city. There's a lot to being classified as a smart city. One of the components is urban mobility. That's a heavy component in that. And I think more places, more companies, more investors are becoming aware of that. When you talk about the ecosystems, it's a lot, back to the puzzle. It's a lot of little pieces to solve.
Exactly. Our Campinas users are our bar raisers. They are very demanding in terms of feedback. There are some cities where we get very good feedback in terms of how great the service is and everything. And the Campinas users, they always find what's missing, and it's very, very funny to dive deep into that because they have very interesting expectations in terms of being a smart city. They're used to technology. They're used to good services in many industries. So I enjoyed that challenge very much.
Yeah, well, here too, it's fair to say, and I've also interviewed persons from the University of Campinas. Unicamp is an educational center. It's also a computer technology. It's a series of research ventures, also a hub, what they call the daughter companies that are formed by former students who continue to reside in the area. Startup. We have many of the Brazilian unicorns actually started here. So there is that interest, and it's one thing building on another, and it starts back with what we mentioned at your beginning with education, right? In your case, melting together Argentina, melting together Pittsburgh, reaching out as you did to a benchmark, right? To wanting to advance. And I think, and obviously there are a number of people like you who understand that success comes again from change, but also disrupting and constant learning.
Absolutely, I strongly believe that. And the interesting part of Quico is that our main investor is a large group that is very strong in transportation solutions in general. They are one of the largest in the world. It's Grupo CCR, CCR Group. They have operations regarding to subway in São Paulo, in Salvador. They have highways, airports, yeah. and the funny thing about what you just mentioned is that sometimes we have a preconception, or we believe that large companies don't embrace change, and the way they invested in us was very, very powerful message that they do want to embrace transformation. So every time we are working on the project and they can give us a hand, and I have different projects they want a technology opinion, they reach out to us. And it was very interesting because my previous experience was like a native digital company that grew from scratch. And in this case, being in constant collaboration with this investor that doesn't come from a technology source or origin. They're urban mobility, their transportation in general, and we are learning a lot from them as well. So that exchange is super powerful. And I think the more big companies start collaborating with younger startups that provide this type of knowledge and that quality of exchange, the transformation is going to be stronger and more sustainable.
I agree with you. I think there's a lot of scratching to be had out there. There's a lot of itch that needs to be satisfied. And when we get back to the basics, we even look back to at the beginning of history in the caves, everything started with foot power, people walking. And it seems with everything that we're doing, we're really back to square one and breaking everything down to one step at a time.
Tom, I lost you for a second.
Yeah, I just said we're back to the point. Everything is one step at a time, literally, back to the pedestrian area of mobility and then building on that.
Yeah, at least in our perspective, we see a future with less private cars, with less people owning cars. So the future of urban mobility has more to do with intermodality, like combining different types of transportation and a system that works in a seamless way. Not only when we talk about decision making and routing, but also in terms of ticketing, like how do you pay like once a month for your bike pass and for your subway ticket and Uber or other services without having to make that decision every single time. So we are strongly working to make that happen in Brazil, maybe next year in other countries as well. But it's a very, very interesting challenge, and especially when you realize that apart from the convenience you picture with the whole mobility as a system solution, when we start providing better information for short-term reality users that are now struggling with the pandemic and they don't want to spend 1 hour waiting for the bus. There's a lot of people that need that information, and right now it's like a matter of their own health. How long do I have to wait for the bus? And we are helping those people right now without having to wait to the complete mobility service solution becoming reality in the whole country. Like every single step we take towards that vision, we are improving somebody's life in the process. So that is very, very strong in our belief.
Well, what you just showed, there are a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of opportunities, and there will be a lot of success here in Brazil. Uriel, I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank you for sharing and for taking part, and success in your future.
Thank you very much, Tom, for having me. It's been a pleasure, and we'll talk in the future.
We'll certainly be back and we'll talk more. I want to thank you for sharing your time with our listeners. And for our listeners, you can find more about Uriel Jaroslawski. And his first name is Uriel, and the last name is Jaroslawski. Uriel Jaroslawski on LinkedIn. I'd like to thank our audience and our sponsor, Focus MI Market Intelligence. Focus MI specializes in market research for the Brazilian agricultural market. More about them on their site, which is focusmi.com. Visit our website, talktobrazil.com. Find our previous shows of Talk to Brazil podcast, which are also available on the major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Remember, when you talk to Tom, you talk to Brazil and the world. Goodbye, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Tom Rioch on Talk to Brazil, the business connector to Brazil.